So welcome everybody to the live training. We're so excited to be here today. I'm here with Danielle, who I'll introduce a little bit more in a minute. But we're going to be talking today about how to keep readers reading. So here at StoryGrid, we are dedicated to helping you level up your craft as a writer. And we're going to talk about what it means to actually keep your readers engaged in your writing to make sure they actually get to the end of your book. So I'm really excited about doing this training. It's a really helpful training. You're going to learn some really simple but profound techniques that you can start using today in your writing. It's going to change the way you write starting today. So excited for you and excited for what you're going to learn alongside of us. And so a little bit about what we're going to be doing together for about the next 90 minutes or so. I'm going to do a short introduction here so that everybody knows what we're doing together. And then we'll do a training, and Danielle's going to teach everything that we promised you would learn on this webinar. And then I'm going to tell you about the StoryGrid Guild and why today is the best day to join that. And then we'll open it up to Q&A and answer as many questions as we possibly can. So a little bit about us. If you don't know much about us, if maybe this is your first time coming to one of these, or you just maybe a friend told you about it. So my name is Tim Grawl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid Universe, and Danielle Kiowski is with me. She's going to be doing most of the training, and she's the Chief Academic Officer of StoryGrid University. And everything we do here at StoryGrid is based on the training and methodology developed by Sean Coyne, who's a writer and an editor with over 30 years of experience. And so everything that we teach in this webinar, inside the Guild, everywhere in StoryGrid is based on a methodology that he's developed that goes deep into this idea of writing and trying to take the mystery out of writing of this. We just sit down and kind of write and hope something comes out instead of learning systematically that story has structure and writing has structure, and learning that structure can help you level up your writing. So that's some of what we're going to be learning today. As I mentioned before, our motto here at StoryGrid is to help you level up your craft as a writer. This is what we're dedicated to. Everything that we do here is pointed at this goal of helping you level up your craft as a writer. But when we talk about that, what exactly does that mean? What are those levels? What is it that we're learning together? What are we trying to learn inside of StoryGrid? And so when we start looking at those levels of writing, we see that it hits a lot of these different things. When we sit down to write a book, we think like, okay, I've got to write this story. I've got to write this manuscript. Maybe we're doing a short story. Maybe we're trying to win NaNoWriMo. Maybe we have a big epic story we're trying to tell. But it's not just one thing, of course, it's lots of different things. And so we have a manuscript that you can break down into 4 quadrants. And each of those quadrants have 5 skeletal scenes that have to be there for a total of 20 skeletal scenes. And then, of course, you have a sequence of scenes that tell part of the story. And then you can break it down to individual scenes. And then you can break it down to tropes inside of those scenes. And then finally, all the way down to the beat level and looking at just one or a few sentences at a time. And the thing about writing is to create a book that works, you have to make it work at each of these levels. You have to make sure your beats are working all the way to your full manuscript. And so throughout StoryGrid, we've looked at these in kind of different times and places from the book, when the book, The StoryGrid, came out, and as we've continued to develop the methodology. And we've broken this into these 2 broad ideas of the macro structure and the micro structure of writing, and how these go into those categories. And a lot of what we've done at StoryGrid is focused at that macro level, looking at genre, the 5 commandments, looking at how a story arcs over the 4 quadrants of your story, and trying to understand those macro elements. But we ran into this issue from multiple areas as we continue to develop the methodology and put it into practice, and realizing that even if you were starting to understand those macro elements, we were missing that micro element. We were seeing this when manuscripts were being submitted to the publishing house and seeing how that line by line, scene by scene writing wasn't there. We were seeing it in my own writing on the podcast. And that's when we realized we really needed to focus in on this micro level of writing and start figuring out how to help writers develop this part. So why would we focus on the micro? Why is this so important? It really comes down to this idea that we write our manuscript, right? So, if you're here, you've probably been around writing for a while. You've probably developed a lot of your own manuscripts. You probably have several kind of half-written ones that you gave up on. You probably have some that you've pushed through and finished all the way through. And we finish our manuscript. But at the end, we knew something was wrong, right? And we can tell maybe because we were reading it ourselves and it just felt off, something wasn't working. Maybe it's because we were submitting it to agents and editors and they were turning us down. Maybe we weren't getting good feedback from beta readers. Whatever it is, something's wrong. And a lot of times we're not sure what's wrong, what exactly is wrong and how to fix it. And this is where I found myself in early on when I was trying to write more, is I knew it wasn't working. So I kept trying to look for like this magic bullet. What is it about my book? If I could just learn that thing, then I would be able to fix my book. It would be publishable and be ready to go. And Danielle and I were actually laughing a couple days ago as we were getting ready for this. I was telling her like early stories of me just naively thinking this would be a simple process. And so when we start looking for this magic bullet, maybe we read a book that we thought would give us something. Maybe we took some courses. Maybe we even hired an editor, all promising like this would fix our writing, this one thing. Thinking like, okay, we just got to figure out what that one thing is. And we realized none of this actually worked. And really trying to chase this idea that there's just like one thing that if we just drop that in place, our books would start working. We realize it's kind of like a magic rainbow unicorn. It doesn't actually exist, right? That doesn't actually exist. And the more that you spend some time learning how to write, you realize like, just like everything else, to become really good, to level up your craft as a writer, you're going to have to practice to get better. But of course, that begs the question, well, how do you practice? How do you get better? Do you keep just churning out manuscript after manuscript after manuscript after manuscript, hoping that magically one day you're going to get better? Or is there a structured, systematic way to actually get better? And so at this point, I want to talk a little bit about inside of StoryGrid, when we're looking at the editor and the writer and what their jobs are, we have a really strong view on whose job is what, right? And so when we're looking at a writer, the writer, of course, it's their job to figure out what kind of book are you writing, right? Where do you want to go? What kind of story do you want to tell? So let's say you're going on a drive and you're starting in Chicago, which is right in the middle of the United States. You get to decide where you want to go. Do you want to go west and go to LA? Do you want to go south to Austin? Do you want to go east and head over to New York City? You get to decide. And then your editor's there as your navigator. They're kind of looking at the full trip. They're having that macro view of the trip, and they're going to make sure you stay going in the right direction. You're making the right turns. And your job as the writer is to keep your eyes on the road. Stay on the road, look right in front of you. Don't hit any pedestrians. Don't hit another car. Don't go off the road. Your job is to keep your eyes on the road and that micro view of what's right in front of you, knowing your editor is going to make sure you get where you're going. And so as we realized this, we realized again that we as writers should be focusing on this micro view. How do we write beats and tropes and scenes that keep readers reading, keep readers turning the page? Because we realized if you understood the macro and you kind of laid out this whole story, right? And we got the macro right. It's like, okay, I've got the macro, I've got the big pieces. I know who my antagonist is, my protagonist. I know what's happening at the top of the third quadrant of my story. But the problem is, if our readers get bored by our line by line writing, they will never finish the book, which means they're never going to tell their friends about the book, which means nobody's ever going to hear about our book. And so if we miss the micro, that's the problem. People stop reading. They don't keep turning pages. So that's why that's why our answer to this problem is to focus on learning how the master writers compose compelling sentences to keep their readers engaged in turning pages. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So when you signed up for this training, we promised to teach you 3 things. The first is how to get your readers to care about your protagonist. The second is the story relevance filter. And the third is the importance of Sam. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Danielle Kiowski. She's our Chief Academic Officer of StoryGrid University. She's who does the training inside of the StoryGrid Guild. And I'm going to turn it over to her so that she can walk you through these things and you can start learning how you can write those compelling sentences to keep readers reading. So Danielle, I'm going to turn it over to you. You get to take over the screen now.
Thanks so much, Tim. I love talking about this because keeping readers reading, keeping them engaged is really what we want as writers because when we put words on the page, they don't go anywhere if we don't have someone to share them with and if those people don't stick with our story till the end. And what we really want is we want readers to finish our stories and then say, "Wow, that was great. I'd love to read it again." Or when can I read the next one? Something that shows that they're really invested, that it's not just that they're humoring you because they like you or anything like that, but they really love that story and they want to experience it again or see what else you have to offer. That is the goal of being a writer. And that's something that is our goal to enable you to do here at StoryGrid. But to do that, we got to keep readers reading. We got to get them to the end so that they want the next piece. So as Tim said, we're going to go through these 3 things, but I want to talk about the nature of these 3 things because really they're all going toward this goal of keeping readers reading. So getting your readers to care, getting clear on who you're talking to, and then building that relevance filter, all of it is geared toward getting your reader to turn the page, go to the next page, keep turning pages until they get to the end and then say, "Wow, what comes next?" So, to organize our thinking here at StoryGrid, something that we frequently do is that we talk about Trinity planes. And so, in the Guild, we talk about this all the time. You may have heard it in our other trainings. And Trinity planes are a way of looking at how you naturally approach a problem. And then it's a way of thinking about thinking. So, we apply the Trinity plane concept in a bunch of different ways. But let's look at how it applies here. So in the Trinity planes, we have green, which is on the surface, red above the surface, and blue beyond the surface. So green is how I like to think about things naturally. And this is focusing on concrete textual evidence and events. So this is it refers to the words that are actually on the page. And so you're really looking at the details and the concrete evidence that you have to support them. Above the surface, we're talking about how you process information and the way that that method of thinking really expresses is through experiential simulation. So if you like to think about, what might happen if, and you sort of play that out in your mind, you might be thinking in a red way. And then finally, blue beyond the surface is about connecting up to universal patterns and archetypes and making sure that your story resonates with patterns that transcend time and space. And so we're going to be looking at these different Trinity planes as we go through because each one of the things that we're going to teach you today, each one corresponds to one of these Trinity layers and then contributes to that overarching goal of keeping your readers reading. So let's look again at what we promised to teach you. So how to get your readers to care, connecting to your protagonist, that's an on the page tool. So that's going to be green on the surface. The importance of Sam is at the red level. So this is about thinking about your story in this more experiential way, simulating how your audience might perceive it. And then the story relevance filter is blue. So this is ensuring that your story corresponds to the universal patterns of story and cutting it down so that it communicates that one message that you want to get across to your readers. So this is how each one of those maps onto the Trinity layers, and then we're going to deal with them one at a time. But this will give you a framework for thinking about how each of them is really the same goal of keeping readers reading through the different lenses of the Trinity planes. So let's start with how to get your readers to care. And as I said, this is at the green level. So this is a concrete textual way to create empathy between your reader and your protagonist. And so we'll need to look at how we actually get words on page. When we talk about microcraft, as Tim was talking about with the different units of story, at the very bottom, we're looking at beats. And this is a beat level tool. So what we need to do is look at what a beat looks like when we create it. And here we have a beat structure. What a beat is that you have an input and then an output. And so in the structure, what happens is that something happens to either from one of your avatars, which is the story grid word for character, um, or from the arena, something arises out of the setting, something like that. Something happens. And it's something that's not expected within the or at the level, right, of what's going on. It's something unexpected, something that knocks things off balance. Now that's your input. And what the input does is that it requires a response from someone within the setting. And so it generates an output, and the output is the response to the input. So taken together, this forms a beat. Now, if they fail to output, that's also a beat because the output then is conspicuous in its absence because the input requires that output. So you have this input output pair. Together, they make a beat. And then what we can do is we can start to look at how the input and the output relate to each other. So if I say, hello, and you say hello back to me, that's a perfectly tuned response where it's a script that we're following, essentially. And so, because stories are about transformation, stories are about the way that things change, we want to see differentiation between that input and the output, that it's not the same energy going back and forth, that there are mismatches in the way that people are approaching situations. And that creates that conflict that's going to drive the story forward. Okay. So now we have the schema of what a beat looks like. And we can map that because it's a unit of story. We can map it onto the way that we think about story at a fundamental level, which is the 5 commandments of storytelling. So in the 5 commandments, we have the inciting incident. This is a ball of chaos that knocks things off balance. And then your protagonist will try to respond to the inciting incident in a certain way, based on their current frame, the way that they see the world. So they respond, things aren't going well, things keep failing. And then eventually you get to a turning point progressive complication. And this indicates that their initial strategy for dealing with this situation has failed. Now, this propels them into a crisis where they have to choose what to do about this turning point that has arisen. And then they execute their decision in the climax. And then we see how that worked out for them. So that's the resolution. So very broadly, that's the way that a story works. That's that story spine that runs throughout the narrative. And we'll see this in every unit of story from the global all the way down to the beat. So this is a mapping here of how those 5 commandments work at the beat level and how they intertwine to move the story forward. So your inciting incident is your input. And then many times we'll have the turning point progressive complication and the crisis implied because the beat is so small that we don't have everything explicitly on the page all the time. Sometimes we do have it included if you want to add some narration in there to make sure that your reader really understands what's going on in that beat. And then the output is the climax. So what does that outputter do in response to the input that they're facing? And then the reaction from that other avatar or from the setting, from the arena, is a new input that again requires another output. So all of these are chained together and they're propelling the reader through the story. So one of the things that we know about the 5 commandments, and this is a principle of story, is that the climax must belong to your protagonist. So if you're setting someone up to look like your protagonist, they have to own the climax of that unit of story. If something else sweeps in and takes the climax away from them, that is such a letdown to your reader, and your reader will hate that story. They're going to stop reading because it robs them of their emotional investment in that protagonist. So we know that the climax has to respond has to belong to the protagonist. They have to show their agency. And that takes us back to, the reason that we're telling stories. We're evaluating a particular mode of action. So the protagonist has to have that opportunity to act and to show how they've transformed, what they've learned over the course of the story, and then to have the response from other avatars and the arena in that resolution to have that evaluation of whether that was a good thing to do or not. So, for all of these reasons, it's so, so important that your protagonist is the one acting in the climax. And this is true at that global level because we want to make sure that our stories are structured the right way globally. And it's true at every level of story, all the way down to the bottom here. So, what that means through that correspondence is that the output also belongs to the protagonist. This is overwhelmingly true. So, definitionally, the protagonist of the beat is going to be the outputter. But also, what we find is that the protagonist of a scene is overwhelmingly the outputter of the beats within that scene. And that is the key to getting your readers to care about your protagonist. Because what happens is that when you're reading a story, you experience inputs along with the avatars in the situation. We go through the world and things come at us all the time. Maybe your cat climbs up the back of your chair. This happens sometimes, right? And so things that are unexpected happen to us all the time. We're not in perfect control of our environment. So when you see these things coming in, the reader can empathize with all of the avatars that are facing these unexpected things. And then the reader starts to simulate, how would I deal with that thing? What would I do? And then when they see an avatar deal with that thing, they check their own understanding against what happened with the avatar. Maybe they agree with them, maybe they don't. Then they see the resolution, how that worked out, and they get an evaluation of how they are understanding this situation. So all of the time they're simulating along with the outputter and putting themselves in the outputter's shoes. Now this creates a bond of empathy very quickly because you have that input coming in and you have the output going out. Now, that is aligned if you put the protagonist in the role of outputter, because they're aligning with that proper avatar where they're aligning with the protagonist who has the input coming out or coming in, and then they're thinking about what they would do as the protagonist when they execute that output. If you put a different avatar in the position of outputter, then you misalign that empathy. So this is where you start to have other avatars who are a lot more compelling than your protagonist. And you have readers who are bonding to avatars that you don't want them to care about. You want them, or what you want them to care, right? You want them to care about every part of your story, but you don't want them to empathize in the same way that they do with your protagonist and really create that bond. So if you've ever had the feedback, your story was all right, but I really, really like your antagonist. I think that they're a lot more compelling than your protagonist. This is a possible reason why you're facing that. And it's really just a matter of tweaking a few words to get that pattern to be correct. And then they're not even going to know why it's happening. It's not happening on that conscious level, but they're going to find that they're bonding with your protagonist and really caring about what happens to them as they progress through the story. So, I want to address something here too, because something that we often hear is, well, I don't want a passive protagonist, right? I know that's bad. I want my protagonist to be active. And so if I just have a protagonist who's sitting around waiting for input to come to them, isn't that going to create a passive protagonist that nobody cares about? But no, it's not. So what happens when you have this input and output is that they're not matched, right? They're showing the protagonist's misunderstanding of what's going on around them, or showing how they deal with the situation, whether that is based on a misunderstanding or whether that shows that they have really advanced skills in that particular domain. And so when they deal with the input, they don't have to just respond in a way that goes along with the established scripts. of what's happening in that moment. And in fact, they shouldn't respond that way. So if you have someone come to your protagonist and they say hello and they say hello back, and that's the proper thing to do in that situation, that's socially acceptable, that's not an exciting moment. So we want to make sure that we have things going on that are illustrating the character, the internal drive and motivation of our protagonist. And that's going to keep them from being passive, even though they are responding to outputs. But at the same time, it allows us to create that empathy with them because we're seeing how they respond to different situations, where as readers, we're putting ourselves into those situations and creating that bond with them. And then also, what we're doing is we're showing what motivates them. So if your protagonist is just making decisions out of the blue and we never know why they're deciding to do that thing, it's not compelling because we can't judge whether we would have done the same thing in that situation. We have to know what's prompting them to act in a certain way so that we can run that simulation and we can see whether we would act in the same way and then check our understanding based on that resolution. So making sure that your beat structure is aligned with this, putting your protagonist in the role of outputter, is going to instantly create a much stronger bond between your reader and your protagonist. And this is something you can start doing today. Go through your manuscript, whatever you're writing, see what the first thing that happens is, see that that's an input that is going to require a response from someone, and make sure that it's prompting a response from your intended protagonist and that the protagonist is the first one to respond, the first one to show that that they're the ones that your audience should put their attention on. And that's going to create that instant bond and really help your readers to care about your protagonist. So that takes us through that on the surface level. That's that key way that we can use words on the page to create that bond between our reader and our protagonist. Now let's take a look at the importance of SAM. We're moving into that red information processing level. And this is getting really clear on who you're telling your story to so that your reader can connect to your writing. So this is more about that imaginal level where we're processing, we're simulating what it might be like to hear this story. Now, if you haven't heard about SAM before, not a problem, because we are going to meet Sam. And Sam is your story's best friend. So we will get very comfortable with Sam. And Sam is the single audience member. So this is, if you're imagining telling your story to someone, this is the person you're imagining telling that story to, whether that's through a written medium, through a spoken medium. We like to think about what we call the coffee shop model, where the author is sitting at a table with Sam, and Sam says, I've got a problem. Can you help me with this problem? And the author will then tell the story to Sam as a way of empowering her to solve her own problem. So we have the single audience member, or SAM. It's very important to get very specific with your SAM. So your SAM is not just a mass audience. It's not 12-year-old kids. Because if you've ever met a bunch of 12-year-old kids, they're all different. They're all unique. They all have their own problems. And they all require different stories to help them solve those problems. So we want to get very specific and think about a single individual that we could help, that we could empower with our story. And that's going to be our SAM. And then we place that SAM within this coffee shop model. So there are 3 components to narrative device, and SAM is one of them. So this is someone who faces a double factor problem that is similar to the protagonist. So we want to get, again, very specific on what kind of a problem Sam is facing. Why is Sam coming to our author and asking for help? A double factor problem just means that it's not a simple solution. So, to think about the analogy of driving, if you say, okay, I want the fastest way to get from this side of town to the other side of town, and all I care about is that it's the fastest way, that is something that you can calculate. And we have all sorts of apps that do this for us, whichever ones you like to use. It's very simple to figure out. I mean, it's complicated to figure out what the fastest way is, but it's not complex. It doesn't require different solutions based on who's asking, based on the situation. It's just a calculation problem. So even though it might be difficult to figure out and we might need algorithms to do it, it is a problem that we can solve and that we can solve in a consistent and predictable way for all time. Whereas a double factor problem is really hard. Should I take this job? Well, that depends, right? So it depends on who you are. It depends on what the job is. It depends on where you are in your life. Maybe you should take that job today, but you shouldn't take that job next year. Maybe, there are all of these different things. So double factor problems are those problems that really do depend on the situation. Now, if you're facing a double factor problem, you come to somebody, you're not looking for an algorithm to help you get across town, right? There are apps for that. But if you need advice, this is where you're coming to someone who can act as a mentor to you. Or we have different archetypes for the author too, but we won't get into that very deeply today. But someone who can help you to understand your problem, because you don't need a solution so much as you need help figuring out and processing this problem. So the author is someone who's capable of and wants to tell the story. And we call it a pop story. This is another concept that we have at StoryGrid where this is about the proposition of the story to shed light on Sam's problem. So if I say, okay, should I take this job or not? I come to you and you tell me, no one should ever work in this industry. That's not helpful, right? Because the answer actually does depend. And so what you want is someone who is going to address the problem by empowering Sam to explore her problem. So that's going to be your author. And when we look at the narrative device, we separate out the author and the artist. And this is something that we go into a lot at StoryGrid, because we want to make sure that it's someone who is matched well with Sam and is speaking to her problem. And so it's within you, you are the artist, the author is within you, but not it's not just you. There are reasons why that's really helpful to think about, because just as all of the 12-year-old kids that you might want to tell stories to are different, you have different ways of presenting yourself to the world. So if you think about this, think about when you go to work and you talk to your manager, and think about, when you go out to a bar and you talk to your friends, think about when you talk to your kids. All of these have different ways in which you present. You might use different language, you might choose different facts to present, all of those things. And if you don't know which situation you're in, then you don't know how to optimally show up to ensure that your message is getting across to your listener. So if you start talking to your kid the way that you talk to your manager at work, it might get weird. They might not understand why you're talking to them this way. They might not get what they need from that conversation. And so what we want is to create consistency as you're writing your story, because as you show up to the page day after day, it's easy to kind of get off track, to show up as who you are this day. Maybe I get home from work and I go to my computer, I open it up and I'm writing, I'm still in work mode. Or maybe, I've just gone out and I come home and I'm like, all right, I've got a little bit more energy for the night and I'm reading, but now I'm in friend mode. So there are all these different modes of being. And so by ensuring that you come back to the same mode, you ensure that you have a consistent voice and a consistent way of approaching the story so that you're telling the story to the right person. And that's why we have this coffee shop model, because you can imagine coming into the story. So if we say, okay, well, my Sam is this particular 12-year-old kid who's having this problem, then I know that I'm going to show up as I would talk to that particular person every time. It creates consistency, it creates a coherent experience for your reader, and it helps to shed light on their problem, who's the problem with a solution that is context dependent and that requires them to weigh values. So it gives them, another way of looking at this is that you're not just giving them a fish, but you're teaching them to fish. And you're teaching them to fish by looking at different ways of weighing different priorities and competing values. And that is going to help them to approach problems in this space with the skills that they need to find the best solution for themselves. So it's a really empowering setup. It makes sure that we care about our readers and that we respect them and that we honor their experience. So this is why we love this narrative device setup, and it all comes back to Sam. So by getting to know your single audience member, by thinking about one person who could really benefit from hearing your story and thinking about, just imagine that situation where they come to you in a coffee shop and they say, hey, I have this problem, or the kitchen table, whatever table you want. But they come to you and they say, I have this problem and I really need help with it. Understanding who that person is, that's going to help you build out your author persona. It's going to help you understand the core of their problem, that double factor problem. And that is going to help you make consistent and coherent choices in your story all along the way. And that's going to help you create a coherent experience that really allows the reader to immerse themselves in that situation. Now, another thing that I want to cover with Sam is, the question of, well, I want my story to have a lot of readers. I don't want my story to just have one reader, because if I write my book and only one 12-year-old kid buys it, that's not great for me. Absolutely. We want your story to reach a mass audience too. But the way to do that, I know it seems paradoxical, is by really focusing in and getting to know that one person, because specificity unlocks universality. It cuts through our defenses and it makes us really care about the story. So, if I start just giving you statements about things that I think are true, ethical statements, something like that, they clash against your existing beliefs for what those things should be. But if you can meet somebody whose experience looks different from the way that you see the world, you start to transform your understanding, because that individual level is so powerful and the empathy that we build with that person is so powerful. And that's why understanding story is so important, because you're getting these different perspectives. And that individual perspective cuts through the things that we think we believe about the world, and it helps us to transform our understanding through seeing other people's perspectives. And so it doesn't matter if you're talking to your 12-year-old child. What you're going to find is that by speaking very consistently to that one person, that is going to unlock your story for your neighbor, for people you haven't met, for people who aren't even born yet, because they'll do the work to simulate being Sam, to simulate being someone who is attracted to and needs help with that problem, as long as it's consistent. And it's going to help them to take on different perspectives, and it's going to help them to transform. So what you need to know is get really specific with your Sam, and that specificity will help to give your story universal appeal and staying power. So the exercise to do today is to think about who would benefit from my story, and what would it look like if I told my story to that one specific person. So that takes us through the above the surface level, where we have that simulation of what that would look like. We're simulating the experience of hearing that story or telling that story. And then we're going to look at the Story Relevance Filter. So this is a tool to ensure that you know what to cut from your writing and what to keep, so your reader doesn't get distracted or bored. Because if they get distracted, they're going to close that book. And that is the double factor problem. Now, we've talked about this a little bit already, because it's something that Sam is facing. Well, it's also something that your protagonist is facing, because Sam and your protagonist should have that bond, should have empathy, and they're facing the same sort of problem. So if I come to you and I say, hey, I have this problem, and you start telling me a story about this one time when you had this completely different thing going on, that's not helpful to me. It might be distracting, but it's not helpful. So to help me illuminate my own problem, the the empowering way to do that is to talk about similar situations where we can look at how someone with a similar problem explored that problem in a different context, and that's going to give me the information I need to start to port that understanding over to my own context. So if it's, hey, I don't know if I should take this job or not, then the answer is, well, let me tell you about a time that I was offered a job, and let's look at the things that I considered to get to whether I took it or not, and then we'll look at how that worked out for me. So your protagonist and your Sam should have aligned double factor problems that they're facing. And then those competing values are pulling on them from different sides, and they have to navigate how to balance those priorities and those competing values within the context. So you have your double factor problem. Now, your double factor problem is going to give you what you need for relevance filtering. And the key is this: your protagonist is facing this double factor problem. Your Sam is facing this double factor problem. And every other avatar in your context, everyone in your story, everyone we see in your story is working in that same double factor problem space. That means that they're all dealing with how to balance those competing values. So if I'm working on how to balance love and obligation, right? Maybe I'm trying to decide whether to take this job, and it would mean, that my family would have to sacrifice what they want, but it's something that I had promised that I would do, something like that, of love versus obligation. Everyone in the context is dealing with love versus obligation in some way. So they're dealing with those competing priorities. And we get to see how different people will look at or will take different paths and what that looks like. And so, one person might choose to, break with their duty so that they can follow love. Another person might abandon the love that they have to fulfill their duty. Other people might find different things in the middle, right? Those would be the extremes. And other people might balance things in different ways. And it doesn't mean that everyone's dealing with the exact same thing. It's not everyone's deciding whether to take a job or not, but everyone's navigating those same values within that same context. And it's showing how you can, it's giving a more comprehensive view of the way that you might approach that trade off so that it's even more empowering for your reader, because they see a lot of different solutions and they start to really understand the fabric of what it means to deal with these competing values. And it illustrates the stakes of different paths. So we can see if different people take different extremes, what that means for them. How does that work out? And you can start to see the author really taking a stand on what it means to balance these priorities in the right way, in a wise way. And finally, it can show context dependence. So maybe you have two different people who have really different roles within this society, and they balance these priorities in different ways. And both of them seem to have achieved a good place within the context. And that can show that it really is a context dependent problem, that it depends on your personal situation and your personal priorities, how you're going to best approach this problem. And so making sure that everyone is dealing with that double factor problem is key to ensuring that consistent experience across the entire story, and to making sure that your reader stays involved, because every single word is going to be relevant to the problem with which they are coming to the story. And so you're going to look at, so it's, we're talking about these universal things, these universal competing values that everybody has to deal with. And then we're bringing it right back down to the page, because this shows us a filter so that every single word of our story is tailored toward helping Sam and empowering her to solve her problem. And we do that by making sure that every avatar, every situation is relevant to that central double factor problem. And so what you can do is identify, you've got your Sam, identify what kind of a problem that Sam is facing, identify what the competing priorities are that make that problem so difficult to solve, And then from there, you're going to be able to look at every part of your story and say, does this inform how I would approach balancing those competing priorities? And that's going to give you your relevance filter to make sure that your reader never gets bored, because everything is critical to helping them understand the problem that they're facing. So that takes us through beyond the surface. And that gives us the three tools that we have for keeping readers reading at these different Trinity planes. So on the surface, you're going to have your protagonist as your outputter. Make sure that they're in that responding position. Above the surface, you're going to think about a very specific Sam and the problem that she's coming to you with. And then beyond the surface, you're going to think about what that problem means, what the competing priorities are that underlie that problem, and how you can show that in every single part of your story. So to take a deeper look at this, let's go and look at an example. So we're going to take a look at The Hobbit, one of our favorites here at StoryGrid, by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, the protagonist, as you might guess from the title, is the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins. And Bilbo Baggins is, at the beginning of the story, living in the Shire. He's living in his hobbit hole. And what we see right from the beginning is that Gandalf walks out of the landscape. He's an old man. Bilbo doesn't realize who he is. And he says, "Good morning," to Gandalf. And you may be thinking, you told me not to say good morning, not 10 minutes ago. I don't know how long ago it was. But in this situation, that is a misattuned response. That is not what Bilbo should be saying when he has this nearly all-powerful wizard walking up to his house, and someone that he should know before, by the way. So he's introducing himself essentially to this man that he knew in the past and who is really deserving of awe and deference by virtue of his wizardly powers. So right away, you have Bilbo as the one who's responding to the situation and the one that we're connecting to. Now, what about the Sam? Well, Tolkien had a very clear Sam because he started out telling these stories to his kids. And so he had real flesh and blood people that he was telling the story to, and he wanted to make sure that they had a consistent experience. But let's think about how Tolkien came to the page, right? So if you've read The Hobbit, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of battle in there. It's really telling the story about someone who is, going out and fighting to preserve the sanctity of the home. And we'll talk about that when we get to the double factor problem. But, it's really about, do I leave the Shire and go on the adventure with these dwarves, or do I not? And Tolkien had a lot of life experiences, right? He was a soldier in World War I, and he'd been through a lot of battles himself, but that's not how he's showing up to the page. He's showing up to the page, and you can see this. So if you have The Hobbit, look at the first couple of pages and look for evidence of this. He is showing up to the page as a grandfatherly figure who is helping a child to understand the problems that they're going to face in the future. He's not showing up to it as a veteran who's talking about his experiences in these wars. He's talking about it because he's talking to a child. He's talking about it from that mentor grandfatherly perspective. And so that's not to say this is the only choice, right? You could tell The Hobbit from a different perspective and it would be a very different story. So these aren't interchangeable either, right? But there are different ways to tell this story. There are different ways to explore this problem space. But he chose the one that was specific to the audience that he wanted to reach and the message that he wanted to send. And that's Tolkien showing up as grandfather, not as soldier. And he's exploring that through the double factor problem. So as I said, this is about, do I leave the Shire and defend my home, or do I stay home and enjoy, what I have? This is something that we all face. Stability versus exploration is right at the heart of human development. It's something that kids go through having to navigate. It's something that we continue to go through as adults. It's really hard. And what you'll see if you go through The Hobbit with this lens is that everyone in The Hobbit is dealing with the problem of, how do I maintain my home with these competing priorities of stability and exploration? So, do I stay in the Shire? Do I enjoy what I've built here? Do I have my second breakfast and my pocket handkerchiefs? Awesome. But if I don't go, then does something come and destroy the Shire later on? So you have to balance that. You have the dwarves who had their home destroyed. And so they are extremes because what really matters to them is reclaiming their ancestral home. And they will stop at nothing to get that homeland back. Then you have Smaug, a dragon who has a hoard of gold. That shows that obsession with home. And so all throughout the book, you have people who are navigating how they can relate to their home and how they can best create a home through balancing that stability and that exploration. And so that's a little bit of an example to help you understand how these things play out in a masterwork. And of course, we love to look at stories through this lens. So as we go through our training in the Story Grid Guild, we go through lots of different examples of this, and in a lot more detail than I can do just on one slide. But in the Story Grid Guild, we have lots of tools for looking at this, and it really helps us to understand what we're looking at with those Trinity planes. So beyond the surface, we have genres, five-leaf clover, and the proposition of possibility. Above the surface, we have narrative, device, and point of view. On the surface, we have scene, event, synthesis, and the five commandments. And then we have three different categories of beats that help us to explore those Trinity planes as they relate to the words on the page. So don't worry too much about this. We're not going to have time to go into all of these tools. That's what the Guild is for. But we have all of these things that take these core concepts that we've gone over today, and we build them out and give you the concrete tools for actually putting these things into practice. So I really encourage you to try out the things that we've talked about today. You have these three things that you can try today to make your writing better. And also, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can join us in the Guild to have a really deep exploration of all of these tools and get supporting tools for how to put them into practice word by word. So, Tim, I'm going to give it back to you to talk about what we do in the Story Grid Guild.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danielle. All right. Okay. So as Danielle just went over, I just want to reiterate this again. And, one of my favorite things about StoryGrid is that I came to it as a fan first. So before the podcast or anything started inside of StoryGrid, there was the book that Sean wrote. I read the book and I loved it, and I knew it was going to help me become a better writer. And the things that Danielle went over today have been transformational for me as a writer as well, of just learning how to put my protagonist into that outputter role, constantly knocking their world off balance, how to understand the double factor problem, how to really focus in on Sam, that single audience member. These have all been super helpful things for me. So I'm excited that you get to learn those, and you've gotten a chance to hear about those today. And now we had two goals today when we were planning out this live training. And the first goal was we wanted to give you useful training that you can put into practice today. So again, thinking through just that idea of your single audience member and that you're writing your story to one person will make a big change. But the other thing is we wanted to introduce you to the Story Grid Guild. So back in 2020, we started the Story Grid Guild, and we've continued to develop into what it is today. But we really wanted to start with this idea of bringing together a group of people that were dedicated to leveling up their craft as writers. And so as we were thinking about what to call it, these definitions really rang true with us of like, we are craftspeople that are learning a craft of telling great stories. And there's nothing more powerful than telling a fantastic story. There's when we think about how the world changes, it's through stories. And the more that you understand stories, the more that you will not be taken in by bad stories, and the more you will be able to help the world become a better place through telling better stories. And so that's what we're dedicated to inside the Guild, is creating a membership of writers dedicated to leveling up their craft as a writer. And so when we start thinking through the Story Grid Guild in this, we're going to tell you more about it here, but we really wanted to come up with this. What are we trying to accomplish inside of the Guild? And we wanted to create a transformational master's level membership for writers committed to leveling up their craft. And I want to focus in for just a minute on this master's level thing. And I'm going to come back to that in a second to talk about what this means when we're looking at the guild. When we're looking at that macro versus micro level, we talked about those three micro levels. And the first was the beat level, right? So this is that smallest unit of change. This is that input and output, stimulus and response. And it's that micro value shift that happens every 1 to 2 to 3 sentences in your story. And a beat builds into a trope, and a trope is a series of beats that moves the momentum of the scene forward, right? And it has a medium size value shift. And then the tropes build into a scene, and a scene is the embodiment of the full 5 commandments of storytelling that shifts the value at that global level. And that's where Danielle went over that. That's the inciting incident that builds all the way to the resolution. And so in the guild, we're focusing on beats and tropes and scenes. And we're really focused in on this micro line by line writing, like I talked about, because this is where we can capture the reader and keep them engaged in our writing. And this is where we've seen over and over that writers need a lot of help learning this and understanding this at this micro level. And so inside a single year of the guild, we've run 3 semesters, and they're 16-week semesters. And inside each of the semester, the focus is to learn engaging and exciting line by line writing that will keep readers turning pages. And this is where we give you this tool set of Sam and the relevance filter and the many other things that she mentioned, including some more. And these are tools in your toolbox so that you can figure out how to write engaging and exciting line by line writing. So what we do inside of the guild is we start with a full analysis of a masterwork scene. We believe that the best way to learn great writing is to look at how the masters have created great writing. And so we look at these scenes and we do a full in-depth analysis of these scenes so we can understand what the writing is doing and what the writer is doing at each line of their writing. And we look at each of the beats in those scenes and what the writer is doing with each of those. And again, we break that out into tropes. So you can see how we're taking this masterwork, we're looking at an individual scene, and we're looking at it at the beat, the trope, and the scene level. And so every semester, we go through this process. So in weeks 1 through 5, we look at the scene analysis and the planning. So we go step by step through a masterwork scene, and we look at how a master writer employed their writing in a single scene. And we start planning out our own iteration of that scene and how we're going to write our scene based on that masterwork scene. And then in weeks 6 through 10, we look at how we write engaging action. How do we write action on the page that keeps the reader engaged in reading? And then as we move into weeks 11 through 13, we look at character development. We look at how do we imbue our avatars with character and show who they are through what they do. And then finally, we write captivating exposition. So we can't just write just action on the page. We have to bring people into our world, and we write that captivating exposition. And we look at how all 3 of these work together to write your own scene. And so you start by looking at the scene, planning your scene, writing your iteration of the scene. Then you go through the learning, and then you write a second iteration of the scene to see how your writing has grown over the semester. So inside of the Story Grid Guild, we have 2 different ways that you can take part in it. So option 1 is our membership level. And how this works is every Sunday you get a new recorded training delivered from Danielle Kiowski, who you just heard from, and the editor-in-chief of Story Grid Publishing, Leslie Watts. And those come out every Sunday morning. The new semester starts January 1st. So that's a Sunday, that January 1st, you're going to get new training. Along with that, you're going to get a weekly writing assignment. So this gives you a way to put this into practice. So remember early on, I was talking about how, it's crazy to think that we have to write an entire manuscript to practice our writing. We think that doesn't make any sense. You've got to practice in these small beat level, scene level writing assignments. So each week we give you a specific way to put that week's training into practice in your own writing. Along with that, you're going to have a group study guide so you can join your fellow guild members to go over the homework and provide feedback to each other. And then also, Sean Coyne, who again is our founder of StoryGrid, he is always researching, always learning new things. And each month he's going to come on and you're going to hear from him the new stuff that he's been working on based on his research and writing as well. And then you'll get an opportunity once a month to do a Q&A with the instructors. So you're going to join Danielle and one of our instructors, and you're going to learn from them and be able to ask questions of them based on what's happening in the guild that month and get your questions answered. And then we also have the StoryGrid database. So this is a database of story elements to help you plan out your own story. So we currently have a macro level look at several different masterworks where you can break a masterwork down into its quadrants, its scenes, and look deep into those. And then over the first semester, we're going to be adding a micro level where you can learn from Masterworks at that beat level and learning the input and output at that beat level as well. So this is what a typical week or a typical month inside of the StoryGrid Guild looks like. Is you get training every week, then you get access to Sean and our instructors as well, and then you are able to work with other people in the guild to learn. We also have an online forum just for guild members so you can connect with other members of the guild, ask questions, learn from other people, discuss what you're learning inside of the guild. Along with that, we really try to focus on providing, when you join the guild, you become a big focus of what we do at StoryGrid. And so anything that we're doing inside of StoryGrid, you get early access to, and you get 20% off of anything. So any of our books, any other trainings, you get at least 20% off access to those as well, because we want to make sure that as a guild member, you're just getting the best value of everything that you're getting inside of StoryGrid. So that's option one. That's membership. That's the self-study where you go through the training each week. If you want to take it further, we have another option where you can work one-on-one with an editor mentor. So we believe inside of StoryGrid that one of the best ways to learn is to get constant feedback on your writing. Again, we don't want to wait until we've generated an entire manuscript to get feedback. We want to get feedback as we're learning. And so we created the editor mentorship level as well. So that includes everything inside of the normal StoryGrid or inside of the normal StoryGrid Guild, everything I just mentioned. But you have a mentor, an editor mentor that walks alongside you. So when you first sign up, you get a personalized writing plan. You work with your mentor, share what your long-term goals with your writing are. So they make sure that all of their feedback is helping you reach the goals that you have for your writing. Each week, when you do that weekly assignment inside of the guild, you're going to get specific feedback and review of your assignment from your editor mentor. And then based on that feedback, they're going to give you an extra assignment to make sure that you can put it into practice again with you in mind in your goals. And then you get the one-on-one coaching call. So this is where you get to get on a Zoom call with your editor mentor, get feedback, ask questions, and make sure you're getting that one-on-one time. And then finally, one of the things that that has provided a lot of just value to the people in our editor mentorship program is the weekly live group coaching calls. So this is only available to editor mentorship students, and they get together and they're able to workshop and train together as a group. And this is our certificate program. So through after you go through the entire guild process, you get an opportunity to do a thesis project and become a certified StoryGrid writer. So that's option two. Now, we've been running this now for a year, this training that we've been talking about today. And so we went out to our current students and we wanted to get feedback from them to see what they thought of it. And so we got lots of great feedback, and I'm going to give you a way that you can see all the feedback that we've got. But I just want to share a handful of the what they've said about the program. So Amy said that the Guild has completely transformed her writing. Annette said there is so much more value than I was expecting. And this is one of the things we just heard over and over and over, is that they signed up knowing that it was going to be great training and provide great value, but it was just beyond what they were even expecting. Pam says this material isn't talked about anywhere else. And this is something else we're really proud of, that the training that Sean has developed and Danielle and Leslie have developed alongside of him is stuff you cannot find anywhere else. If you go out and try to find some other program that teaches at this micro level of writing in this detail, it just doesn't exist. This is something that Sean created based on his experience and his study and research. Kathy said, I've learned so much from Guild that has improved my writing. And Christy said, I always tell anyone and everyone to join the Guild. And we can't, I love hearing that. And so I want to come back to what I said here, right? We wanted to create a transformational master's level membership for writers committed to leveling up their craft. And so I really want to just focus for a second on that idea of a master's level membership. What exactly does that mean? And so if you look at a master's of fine arts in creative writing, right? So this is kind of the standard in the United States of, if you want to become a writer, you should go get a master's of fine arts in creative writing. So let's just look at the cost of that for a second. So the average cost of a master's of fine arts in creative writing is $13,800 a year at a public university. And at a private university, it's over $36,000 just for a year of training towards a master's of fine arts in creative writing. And what's cool is, inside of the StoryGrid Guild, we have a few people that have gotten their MFA in creative writing. And so we went and asked them, like, what did they think if they compared their MFA experience to their guild experience? What did they have to say about it? So Bonnie said, if you need a qualification to teach writing, you should get an MFA. But if you want to become a better writer, you should sign up for the Guild. Randall said, if you want the prestige of having a master's degree, then you should get an MFA. But if you want to learn how to write better, then I think the StoryGrid is a better investment. And Krista said, if you are really looking to write a book from soup to nuts, then you need to do the Guild. And so again, a master's of fine arts and creative writing is over $13,000 a year at a public university, over $36,000 a year at a private university. And if you want to join the StoryGrid Guild, you have two options that we talked about. At that membership level, you get all the weekly instruction, the weekly worksheets, the monthly instruction, monthly training with Sean Coyne, group study guides, early access, foundations courses. We offer that at $960 a semester. So that's a 4-month semester. So the next semester goes from January 1st through the end of April, or you can join at $265 a month. If you would like to get in for that one-on-one editor mentorship, which includes everything in the normal StoryGrid Guild, but you get that personalized writing plan, the weekly assignment review, customized assignments, coaching calls, and weekly live group coaching, that's $680 a month. So even though that is a much better, much lower investment than getting an MFA, we also know, like, you may still be wondering, like, okay, what is this? Is this really worth it? I just want to try it out. So what we've decided to do is, if this is your first time joining the Guild, for your first semester, we're actually going to offer it at an even lower price for your first semester. So you're going to be able to get it for $720 for the first semester, or $205 a month throughout your first semester as well, because we want to make this as accessible as possible, knowing that this is the best writing training on the planet. But we want to make it accessible so that you can get in. So those are the two options that we have available. And to sign up for the guild or to learn more, we have a lot more information about what the guild is, what all the training is entailed, more testimonials. All of that can be found right now at storygrid.com/guild. So we've opened up registration for the guild, and it's open through next Tuesday. And then at that point, we close down the registration so that we can finish preparing for the new semester that starts on January 1st. And so we would love for you to join us inside of the guild. We have a lot of great training, and we're excited for you to be a part of it. And so you can go to storygrid.com/guild right now to see more information there. So we do want to move into the Q&A. So we promised to do a Q&A. We've got about 20 minutes left in the presentation, and we're happy to answer as many questions as we can. So right now, if you do have a question, I know a lot of you, while Danielle was teaching, were kind of posting some questions in the chat, and so many people are in here and we're posting so many things. It's really easy for those to get buried. So I want to invite you to put your questions into the Q&A section. So if you go to your Zoom controls, there's two little talk bubbles and it says Q&A. If you click there, just go ahead and drop your questions in there. You can ask questions about Danielle's training, about the training we do inside the guild, anything about the guild. Now's the time to ask those questions. So go ahead and put those in, and we'll start working through them over the next few minutes here. So Danielle, are you ready to answer some questions?
Yes, ready to
All
go,
right.
Tim.
All right, let's start with this one. What is a trope?
A trope is a relatively small unit of story. So it's not the smallest, like a beat. And a trope is made up of beats. So you'll have, however many you need to do what you're trying to accomplish with your trope. And a trope has a consistent, what we call micro strategy that the protagonist and other avatars within the scene are employing within that trope. So tropes will build to scenes. So it's a way of progressively escalating your scene so that you build the correct arc of the scene. And it's also a way of grouping beats together. So we can look at it top down, bottom up, and the trope lives in that sweet spot. So the way that we identify tropes are through that strategy. So we say, okay, what is at a micro level, what is the protagonist trying to accomplish in this trope? And it goes, toward their object of desire in the scene. And then from there, we can plug them together to create an escalating progression of tropes in a scene. So you may have heard tropes referred to in different concepts. So if you look at lists of tropes, you'll find anything from a particular thing that a person in the story should look like to different ways of characterizing entire plots to all of these things. So if you get a list of tropes like that, what we found is that people want those tropes so that they can fulfill expectations for the story. And that's what we want to do, right? Everybody wants to make sure that their story is doing the right thing, the story works. But when you call tropes, this collection of things that are operating at all these different levels, there's no way to cohere them together into one story. And so that's why we limit tropes to operating on one concrete level of story. So, those other things like the archetypes of different avatars and things like that, we still have prescriptions for, but they're at different levels of the story. Whereas tropes are really at that one level so that they create building blocks that you can plug together to create a consistent scene.
Great. So Jean asked, how many semesters? So we've run the guild on a 16-week semester cycle. So there's 3 semesters in a year. And so you can sign up for a monthly thing, or you can sign up to pay for a semester at a time or a year at a time. And there's different discounts depending on those as well. And again, you can see all of that at storygrid.com/guild. So this one's for you, Danielle. I get active build-up beats and reactive breakdown beats, but what is the third beat? What are binding beats?
Right. Binding beats, that's the third beat type. And that is something that we go into at length in the guild. And that is about how your author would communicate directly to your Sam. So the way that you might be used to thinking about it are authorial description or narration, those kind of things. And so those are binding beats, and we'll teach you how those function within the structure of the scene.
All right. Ling asks, does Story Grid apply to fiction, nonfiction, memoir, or all of these? I'll let you take that one, Danielle.
We have a narrative focus, and so when we're looking at masterworks in the guild right now, we do look at fiction masterworks and focus on that. The skills that you're learning help you put words on the page, and so if you're writing narrative nonfiction, memoir, all of this is going to be directly applicable to what you're doing. And also, because we're teaching you the skill, which is a lifelong skill, of ensuring that the signal in your communication is coming through clearly and eliminating noise from that signal communication, we have found that this does help no matter what you're writing. So you might be writing nonfiction blog posts, you might be writing all these different things, even just telling stories out loud, talking to people, it's going to help you approach those situations. But the focus of the material is on anything narrative based. So primarily fiction, narrative nonfiction, and memoir.
All right. Bob asks, what is the time commitments to be successful with the guild?
We would say that the training that comes out every week will be a larger time investment as you get used to these concepts, as you get used to the training. And then you'll have your worksheet that you will do your meeting with your group if you are planning that meeting. And so a lot of this is variable depending on how often you decide to meet and things like that. But generally, what we find is that it's about 5 hours per week to go through the training, go through the assignment, and meet with your group and all of those things. And so then the editor mentorship has some additional time commitment because you have your meeting with your mentor, and that's half an hour every 2 weeks, and then you have your weekly meetings and your additional practice.
All right. This is from Francine and specific to some of what you were teaching. During the inciting incident, if your protagonist is prevented by a mentor character from her initial response to the output, has she lost agency?
Yeah, this is something that we go over when we talk about different ways of creating those input output pairs. But yes, if someone swoops in and acts in place of the protagonist, then it tells you a lot about whether they think that the protagonist can handle that situation. And it also it interrupts the exercise of their agency in that moment. I would quibble a little bit with the wording, and this is, getting into the weeds there. I wouldn't say that they've lost agency necessarily because they might not have lost the capacity to act, but the exercise of it has been stopped in that moment.
I have a manuscript because could I use it for this training?
No, we ask that you set aside your work in progress and really focus on generating new things for the exercises in the guild. There are a few reasons for that. So, one, I just want to say from our experience, what we found is that if people bring their works in progress to the guild and try to adapt them, it does not work for them. So this is something that we've seen proven out in reality, that it goes very badly if they try to apply that. We think there are several reasons for this. One is that you have a lot of um, emotional connection to your work in progress or your finished manuscript, whatever it is. So you're going to be less likely to want to break things and reconfigure things to do the exercises. And doing the exercises faithfully is what's going to build your skills. So we do not care what it looks like when you're done, right? I mean, we want you to write scenes that work. We want you to write great scenes. We're always going toward that. But what's important is that you make progress. So you write your first draft, you write your second draft. We want to see progression in that because what we care about and what we hope that you care about when you're coming to the guild is that everything you write for the rest of your life is better. So whether that scene turns out awesome within that semester does not matter. And if you have that connection to your work in progress, or you have this pressure because it's part of your manuscript, you're not going to have the same sort of freedom to experiment and fail, to learn things. And so that's really, really important. Another thing is that we're going to be trying out different contexts, so different masterwork patterns, different constraints. And so if you are writing within your own work in progress or your own universe that you've already set up, it can be very difficult to conform to the required constraints to create a scene that works within the pattern, especially as we work through, the masterwork patterns in these early semesters. And so what you end up doing is spending a lot of time and energy trying to shoehorn the two of them together. And what ends up happening is that because of that connection that you have to your work in progress, the constraints that we're asking for break, the exercises that we're asking for break, and you don't end up applying them in the ways that are most helpful. And so you don't get that skill development because that existing structure is standing in the way of it. And so it's much better to come with an open mind and be able to apply things. Just don't waste that effort trying to make them match. Instead, you're just generating something that matches already. And that way you can take your attention and your energy and you can focus it where it needs to be, which is on skill development and faithful completion of those exercises.
Yeah, and I'll speak to that too. Yeah, I'll speak to that too. We really do focus on the idea of skill development. So the metaphor I like to think about is that of, like, let's say you wanted to become a woodworker, and you had this idea of like this beautiful ornate, dining room table that you wanted to build. And you know that, maybe you've even tried to like go out to the shed, get the wood, get the tools, and start building this table. And you just can't seem to get out of your head and into reality, right? So what you see in your head, you just don't have the skills to actually create in the real world. And so what we see the Guild doing is coming alongside of you. And just like if a master woodworker came alongside of you and said, hey, let's put your table down for a second. And what I'm going to do is take you over here and I'm going to teach you a lot of individual skills. So I'm going to teach you how to use the planer. I'm going to teach you how to, saw correctly, how all the different types of chisels you have to use and how to use those. And you spend some time just developing the skills with each of these tools. Then later, when you go back and you decide, now I'm going to build this table, you're able to get out of what you see in your head and actually create it in the real world. And that's how we see this. And this is what I've experienced, right? I came to StoryGrid as a writer that just wanted to write something, had been trying for years, couldn't create anything. And as I've learned this, I've developed skills that I will now write better for the rest of my life. Right. And so this is where it was really hard for me to stop working on my work in progress inside of this context. Right. I'm always writing on the side, but when I'm in this, I had to put that aside and think, for now, I'm just going to work on this and get better at skills. And what's been amazing is when I go back to my writing later, I see how my skills have come up. And then Sean has seen it, and Danielle and Leslie have seen it as well, that I've been able to take these skills that I've learned in the training like the Guild and apply it to my writing outside of it. So it's been really amazing. I'm going to answer this one. Lisa said, what's the biggest thing you've unlearned since doing this work? For me, it's focusing on me during the writing. So a lot of times as a writer, we're kind of thinking like, what do I want to say? What am I trying to say? What am I trying to put on the page? And this is where it becomes really hard to know what to actually write, because I've got so many things to say and I've got, so many different ways I want to say it and so many things I want to share. How do I actually get this down in a cohesive story? So taking the focus off of me and putting it on Sam, on that single audience member, on this one person that I'm trying to tell a story to for a very specific reason, to help them with a double factor problem. is how I've been able to tell clearer and clearer and clearer stories. And so a lot of this, I feel like a lot of the advice about writing makes it even more egocentric, right? It's all about, listening to your muse and trying to figure out what your heart wants to say and all of those things. And of course, I'm saying things that I want to say, but getting really, really focused on who I'm trying to talk to and the story I'm trying to tell that person. That has made the biggest difference of just really focusing on that. And again, inside the guild, we give really specific ways to learn how to do that in your writing that apply again to every single sentence that you write. This, I think, is what's been the most amazing to me, is how this has changed literally the word choice in the sentences that I'm writing while I'm writing. And so this affects in this we're really focused on you actually writing, right? So this isn't just about analysis, it's about learning what you're trying to write and applying it in real time as you write. um let's see. Let's see. Okay, Donald says, when I hear trope, I think of stereotype or cliche. For example, the engineer who can't communicate. How is story grid trope different from that?
So that kind of a trope is one of the membership of that list of tropes that I was talking about before, where if you Google that, you're going to get all of these things at different levels of story. So we are constricting our understanding of trope to be at a specific level of story so that they can all work together.
So speaking of that working together, is a new ask, is there a way to make tropes interconnected seamlessly?
Yeah, the way to do that is to make sure that they all contribute to a unified object of desire. And so that way you're creating a unified progression for the scene. And then you can order the tropes in the way that makes the most sense to escalate conflict over the course of the scene.
Valerie asked, how do you decide who Sam is?
Think about someone who needs to hear your story. So think about someone who's facing a problem who you want to help. So remember, the author is someone who can help and who wants to help by empowering Sam through telling a story. And so think about someone that you wish you could get a message to. And then that is a Sam to start with. And then you can think about them at all levels, right? You can think about, what would I say to them? What details would I include? What kind of stuff do they already know and what can I leave out? And you can really just use that very specific person to shape the way that your message looks. But what really matters, and this is also, Tim, I thought it was great when you were talking about learning that the Sam is the most important. And this is where that gap bridges, where it is about Sam, and it's also about a story that you want to tell. So you pick a Sam that you want to help. You pick a Sam that matters to you, and that's how you're telling a story that you care about and you're conveying a message that you care about, but the focus isn't on you. You're doing it to help other people. You're doing it to help the world, because this story is going to outlive you.
Yeah, I mean, I just finished a first draft of a manuscript about a week ago, and it was really interesting because I knew the story I was trying to tell. Like I knew the story I was trying to tell. I knew a lot of the places in the story it was going to go. Like, I'd been thinking about it and figuring it out. And then I started thinking through this, a lot of the stuff that we talked about, but I'm just going to keep using Sam as an example, the single audience member. And so I'm like, okay, who is this person? And I got really specific. Like, I know how old they are. I know how, if they're married or not, how many kids they have, where they are in their career. Like, I got really, really specific about this person. And then I started writing the story with that one person in mind. And it took all of these ideas that were kind of in my head and kind of floating around, and it just focused them in, just like, when you had the magnifying glass and you focus in the light into one little pinpoint. That's what these kinds of things do. And so, and that goes into the other stuff that Danielle talked about with the relevance filter and all of that, is helping you understand exactly where you're going with this story. It's been transformational. Um, so let's see. I had another one I was. Oh, can you give an example? This is for you, Danielle. Can you give an example of what a weekly exercise looks like?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit generally about the structure of a worksheet. So the worksheet has three different components to it. The first is the concept review, and this is where you get the chance to check your understanding of the concepts that we covered during the training videos for that week. And sometimes this is, coming up with definitions for the terms that you're learning about. And sometimes this is about reflecting on how those concepts apply in this particular context that we're studying during the semester. So that's what that looks like. Then you have a masterwork example section, and that is where you take things that we're reading. So we give you example scenes to read, things like that. And through that reading, you learn how to look at these concepts in a different way and in a different context rather. And so you apply the tools analytically to figure out how to understand that masterwork example. And the reason for that is that it it deepens your understanding of how the concepts function in Masterworks and allows you to then use those lessons to apply them in your own stories. So we have the main masterwork pattern that we're studying, but what we find is that if you just study one thing, you can get really really locked in, and so it's pivotal to understand. It's very very important to understand the core masterwork pattern scene that we're putting out there, but you can understand it better through comparison and contrast. So we have other scenes that illuminate different parts of this masterwork pattern, and they help you to better understand how to write your own iteration, how to create your own story coming out of that scene. And so that's why we focus on the masterwork example. And then the third component of the worksheet is your writing exercise. And so what this looks like is that you are um so I want to differentiate this because there are 3 times during the semester where you'll write or revise your draft. And then during the weekly exercises, what you'll do is that you'll practice generating beats from different perspectives. And or maybe sometimes you are doing planning to think about different ways that your avatars might approach a particular situation. So what happens is that through each week, they look very different, but what they're helping you do is to understand the mechanics of how your iteration is working and find different ways to innovate and different ways to get your signal across. So they're targeted exercises that help you to not only make sure that you are revising your scene well, but also that that you understand and explore all of the possibilities. So if an avatar can act in one of these different ways, maybe a spectrum of ways, you try both extremes and you say, how does it change my story if my avatar is all the way over here when I thought they were all the way over here? And what that does for you is that we come to the page with a lot of preconceived notions of human behavior because we are humans. And so we understand a partial spectrum of possible human behavior. And what we want to do is target these exercises to help you push out your understanding so that you understand more of the full range and you can eliminate blind spots that would prevent you from writing avatars that look a certain way or behave a certain way look a certain way on the page, right? Behave a certain way. And that's going to broaden your ability to explore different problem spaces and write stories that really speak to the human condition because you're learning more about it as a whole.
Great. All right, so we're at time, so I'm gonna just go through a couple, try to hit a few more questions that are here. So Donald asked, if I define Sam narrowly with a particular double factor problem, won't that restrict the readership to a small percentage? It actually does the opposite. So Danielle touched on this a little bit, but what's really amazing about stories, and this was one of the first things Sean taught me early on, was that specificity breeds universality. The more specific you make a story, the more universal it becomes. The more you try to write for a broader and broader audience, the more it doesn't actually resonate with anybody. And so that's why we get so specific. Um, are there examples of this method in authors like Shakespeare or Jane Austen? We actually use Jane Austen in the program. So one of the semesters that you can go through is Jane Eyre. You also look at The Name of the Rose or The Aeronaut's Windlass. So again, we believe heavily in looking at masterworks, and so that's what we do in each of the semesters. Um, yeah, so we're gonna wrap it up there because we're at time. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. We got through most of them, but I really appreciate everybody being here and being a part of this training. We really enjoy sharing this with writers, and so just you being here and being a part of this. I know Danielle loves sharing this as well. We do highly recommend you check out the Guild. Registration is open for about another week, and then we'll start getting ready for the new semester. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Danielle, for sharing, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.